Have you ever seen someone in a position of power and thought, how the hell did they get there? Because let's be honest, we've all witnessed cases like this. People who don't seem to have a clue what they're doing, yet there they are, making decisions, leading teams, and appearing in interviews as if they were geniuses. Meanwhile, truly qualified, ethical, and intelligent people remain invisible, trapped in secondary positions, as if the system were designed to ignore them. And you know what's most disturbing? This happens so much in so many different places that one begins to suspect it's not a coincidence. Perhaps there's something more to it. A twisted but powerful logic that makes the least qualified end up having more influence than those who truly understand things. And that's where one of the most controversial political philosophers in history comes in. Nicholas Machiavelli, the same one that many cite but few truly understand. Today, we're going to dive into his ideas, not as an academic exercise, but as a tool to understand what's happening right now in the real world. Machiavelli wrote centuries ago that the prince wasn't a fantasy about how leaders should behave. It was a brutal snapshot of how power moves in real life. He understood that appearances are often more important than the truth, that projecting confidence is worth more than being right, and that often, ironic as it may sound, overthinking is precisely what prevents you from leading. This takes us straight to the heart of a problem we have not yet solved, because intelligence, ethics, and competence often become obstacles rather than advantages. Machiavelli wrote his most incendiary ideas while in exile, removed from the politics he loved so much. But it was precisely in that isolation that he developed a cold, crude, and deeply realistic vision of power. Instead of imagining how leaders in an ideal world should act, he focused on how they actually act in the world as it is. One of his most brutal phrases makes it clear: everyone sees what you appear to be, few sense what you really are. With that, Machiavelli throws an uncomfortable truth in our faces. Perception matters more than reality. In other words, you don't need to be competent. Just show up, and then this strange phenomenon begins to take shape. Those who shout the loudest, those who promise the most, those who appear to have answers, are the ones who end up with power. What Machiavelli observed, and what remains true today, is that showing too much intelligence can be dangerous in a power struggle. Why? Because truly intelligent people often have characteristics that, paradoxically, work against them. They tend to see nuances where others see simple answers. They think before acting. They question rather than affirm. And in an environment where people seek absolute certainties, these virtues are perceived as weaknesses. Do you notice that while the populist leader shouts, "I have the solution," the reflective thinker says, "This is more complex than it seems." And guess who the masses follow? The one who offers security. This is the fate that befell Socrates. A profound but uncomfortable sage questioned everything, and that's why he was silenced, because in politics, often the one who has the truth doesn't win. The one who has the simplest narrative wins. A provocative study published in 2017 by the Journal of Management revealed a truth that many find difficult to accept. Intelligence is indeed related to leadership effectiveness, but only up to a certain point. Specifically, up to an IQ of approximately 120. From there, the higher a person's intelligence level, the more difficult it is for them to connect with others, influence, and inspire leadership. And why does this happen? Because their way of thinking becomes too sophisticated, too abstract, as if they were speaking another language that most can't translate. In other words, being too intelligent can make you invisible, misunderstood, or even dismissed. Your ability to see clearly becomes an obstacle in a world that prefers easy explanations and promises without nuances. And although it may sound harsh, the reality is that in many cases, people don't follow the one who is right, but rather the one who speaks with the most conviction. But IQ doesn't explain everything. If being intelligent can become a disadvantage in the struggle for power, then the big question arises: what traits make certain people rise so quickly in leadership structures? And the answer lies in our deepest psychology. We've seen it 1,000 times. The voice that dominates the most in a conversation isn't always the wisest, but the most confident. That person who doesn't hesitate and asserts everything forcefully, even if they're saying outrageous things. This is where one of our mind's most dangerous cognitive biases comes in, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Discovered in the 1990s by psychologists David Donning and Justin Kruger, this phenomenon shows that people with less knowledge tend to believe they know more than they actually do, while true experts, aware of their own limits, doubt, question, and rarely display arrogance. That's why ignorance isn't just bold. It can also be tremendously persuasive. Modern science confirms what Machiavelli already sensed centuries ago in the dynamics of power. Perception can be worth more than actual ability. A study published in 2020 by the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who displayed overconfidence were seen as more competent leaders by their peers, even if in practice they weren't. Why? Because appearing confident gives the impression of clarity and authority in a world where the majority is lost. Whoever speaks with certainty, even if they are wrong, end up being followed. And it's not just theory. Look at historical figures like General George Armstrong Custer, whose arrogance led him to make disastrous decisions in battle, but who was still promoted and revered by his soldiers. In Russia, oligarchs did not rise through merit, but through connections and blind trust during privatization. In Singapore, however, institutional mechanisms were designed precisely to prevent charisma from overriding technical competence in leadership processes, and that makes a difference. A study conducted by Stanford and Houston universities in 2012 concluded something chilling. Narcissism, not competence, was the best predictor of who would end up as a leader in groups without a clear structure. As a result, those groups didn't function better, but they believed that this is how the illusion of leadership works. When someone projects certainty, our brain tends to assume they also know what they're doing, even when it's not true, and that brings us to an even more disturbing point. Our brain, by design, is hardwired to fall into these traps. We use mental shortcuts to assess whether someone is competent or not. When someone speaks firmly, they project confidence, or when they make quick decisions, we interpret that as intelligence. These mechanisms were useful for our ancestors, who needed to act quickly in a dangerous environment. But in the modern world, those same shortcuts become a problem because true experience, one based on facts, doubts, and nuances, is often accompanied by uncertainty. Those who truly know recognize that there are no easy answers. Meanwhile, incompetents who appear to have everything under control appear more trustworthy at first glance. This is how they rise, but there's still more. The most perverse part is that once they reach the top, they are not content with just being there. They do everything possible to stay in power, no matter the cost, and this is where Machiavelli becomes prophetic. He observes something that today's organizational sciences have confirmed with data. Incompetent leaders, when they feel insecure, tend to surround themselves with people even less competent than they are. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, "The best way to know the intelligence of a ruler is to observe the men who surround him." And he was right. Fragile leaders select mediocre subordinates, not because of a lack of options, but because they feel threatened by true talent. They prefer blind loyalty to competition. The result is a web of mediocrity that spreads. Instead of seeking the best for the group, the leader seeks what's best for his ego. And that creates a culture where asking questions is frowned upon, where expressing a different opinion is punished, where intelligence becomes a danger. Does this sound familiar? The most dangerous thing about this dynamic is that it doesn't stop at the top. It spreads like a virus throughout the system. It's what organizational scientists call structural homophily, the tendency of leaders to surround themselves with people similar to them, with the same weaknesses, the same limited vision, and the same fear of being overtaken. This is how, little by little, bubbles of incompetence disguised as authority form. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever worked in a place where asking questions was frowned upon? Where pointing out mistakes made you the problem? These aren't just toxic environments. They're symptoms of a leadership network built on fear and mediocrity. Competition is replaced by obedience. The entire organization begins to wither from within. And yet, despite all this evidence, we continue to elect leaders who offer simple answers to complex problems. Why then does our brain crave certainty when everything around us seems uncertain, chaotic, and threatening? The figure of the leader who says, "I have the solution," becomes almost irresistible. And that's where the incompetent shine, not for what they know, but for how confident they seem. True experts, on the other hand, speak prudently, recognize nuances, and admit what they don't know. And although a sign of wisdom, this doesn't always convince the masses. As Machiavelli wrote, most men are carried away by appearances as if they were realities. In times of crisis, that emotional need to cling to an absolute truth, even if it's false, becomes stronger than ever. Think about any number of global crises, pandemics, wars, economic collapses. Who do the majority usually follow? Not the leader who says, "This is complicated, it will require sacrifices and reflection," but the one who, in a firm tone, promises that everything will be resolved quickly and painlessly. The one who claims to have a simple and definitive plan. We see it all the time. Climate scientists, for example, speak carefully. They offer margins of uncertainty. They recognize the limits of their models. But populist leaders, on the other hand, reduce everything to a slogan. No problem. Everything is under control. This is an invention. And guess who gains more support? The same thing happens with the healthcare system. While experts explain that every solution involves a cost, a risk, or a commitment, politicians appear promising miracles without consequences. And the worst part is that in most cases, that simplistic narrative is the one that wins votes and power. And if that already sounds worrying, wait until you hear what researchers at Yale University discovered. In a 2017 experiment, they presented participants with political problems with complex mathematical data. The result was that the smartest people were not necessarily those who were the best problem solvers, but rather those who used their intellectual capacity to justify their prior political beliefs, even when the data contradicted them. Do you realize that it's not just a lack of information? It's about how, even with data in hand, our brain prefers to protect its ideology rather than accept an uncomfortable truth. Psychologists call this cognitive closure, the desire to find definitive answers instead of tolerating ambiguity. The more threatened we feel, the stronger that need becomes. We become more likely to see the world in black and white, and more vulnerable to authoritarian leaders who promise us total clarity amidst chaos. This creates an extremely dangerous dynamic. The more complex and frightening the world becomes, the more susceptible we are to falling into simplistic thinking and following leaders who sell us magical solutions. It's as if our mental immune system fails just when we need it most. Instead of seeking understanding, we seek relief instead from nuance. We seek certainty. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever been drawn to an explanation precisely because it was simple, direct, definitive, even though deep down you knew the reality was much more complicated? That feeling is no coincidence. It's our brain trying to protect us from the emotional collapse that comes with staring the chaos of the real world head-on. And it's at that point where charisma overcomes reason and false security becomes an emotional drug. But there is something even more troubling. Even intelligence does not guarantee that a person can resist the manipulation of power. This is where Machiavelli becomes more disturbing. He not only spoke to us about appearances or political manipulation, he also warned that morality is often an obstacle in the struggle for power. In one of his most controversial passages, he wrote, "A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not use it, according to the necessity of the case." And although that phrase may sound cynical, it contains a brutal truth. The most intelligent people tend to also develop a more complex moral conscience. They reflect and question themselves. They doubt themselves. But in a scenario of fierce competition, where others do not have those ethical restraints, that depth can become a disadvantage, because those without limits are always willing to go one step further. Those who promise what they won't deliver. Those who manipulate the fears of others. Those who betray without remorse often advance faster than those who act ethically. Because while the intelligent person hesitates, the cynic has already made a move. While the just person thinks about the consequences, the ambitious person has already positioned themselves. History is full of these contrasts. Cicero, brilliant, upright, and principled, was ultimately defeated by Julius Caesar, who did not hesitate to literally and symbolically cross the Rubicon to seize power at all costs. The same thing happens in today's world. Honest candidates with complex proposals face rivals who have no problem lying, manipulating, or destroying reputations. Often those rivals win because what's at stake is not who has the best idea, but who knows how to play the game with less. Researchers at the University of British Columbia discovered that traits associated with psychopathy, such as a lack of empathy or emotional manipulation, are linked to faster promotion when accompanied by social charisma. The most manipulative leaders tend to rise faster than their ethical colleagues, and this creates a race to the bottom when immoral tactics start to work. Others feel pressure to imitate them or fall behind. Over time, this power game contaminates the entire system, making manipulation and lack of ethics cease to be the exception and become the norm. And at this point, everything seems bleak. One might think, then, that there is no way out. The worst always win, but that's not entirely the case because not all environments reward incompetence and corruption. In fact, there are contexts that, by design, favor true merit, and that's where our Machiavellian opportunity begins. Different environments reward different types of behavior. Some spaces are structured to value competence because failure is visible and immediate. For example, a surgeon whose patients don't survive, or an engineer who designs a bridge that collapses, cannot hide their lack of skill in professions where feedback is rapid and mistakes have serious consequences. Incompetence has nowhere to hide, but there are other environments where failure can be disguised, justified, or even embellished. In those contexts, such as politics, large corporations, or the media, incompetence can flourish undetected for years. Why? Because the final result is diffuse. The impact is collective, and the narrative can do everything. A politician can blame his predecessor. An executive can cook up numbers. The structure also influences systems with overly concentrated power, without checks and balances or real oversight, becoming the perfect breeding ground for mediocre leaders. This was what happened in the Soviet Union. Power became so closed and opaque that it eventually stifled any attempt at authentic competition. In contrast, countries like Germany, with more distributed governance systems and cross-supervision, managed to limit excesses because they did. When the environment changes, the type of leader who survives also changes. A key factor determining whether competition flourishes or not is the clarity with which success can be measured. When objectives are concrete, visible, and evaluable, such as saving lives, building something that works, solving a tangible problem, merit tends to speak for itself. However, when success depends on subjective perceptions, empty rhetoric, or results that cannot be easily verified, the winner is the one who best sells an image. As Machiavelli said, men judge more by their eyes than by their hands because everyone can see, but few can touch. Most people make their judgments based on appearances, not on deeper realities, especially in complex areas where only a few have the technical knowledge necessary to know who really knows what they are doing. And if we add poorly designed incentive structures to that, the problem worsens when systems reward short-term results instead of lasting impacts. The superficial becomes profitable. Look at what happened in the financial crisis of 2008. For years, banks and executives were rewarded for generating quick profits, even if they did so by taking extreme risks that ended up collapsing the global economy. Why? Because the incentives were misplaced? Instead of rewarding solidity, they rewarded spectacularity, and that fostered leaders who knew how to manipulate appearances but lacked the substance to sustain what they built. So, if you look around you, ask yourself what kind of environment you are inhabiting. One that encourages real competition, excellence, and merit, or one that allows incompetence to grow in the shadow of charisma and self-promotion. Understanding these dynamics not only helps you observe the world, it also helps you navigate it, because even in systems that are well-designed, incompetent leaders can break through if they master certain psychological tactics. It's no coincidence that they manage to stay in power by applying specific strategies to manipulate public perception and deactivate their Machiavellian opponents. The Machiavellians would have recognized them instantly. The first is to create a clear division between us and them by turning all criticism into an attack by the enemy. They manage to shield themselves from accountability. Any accusation is interpreted as betrayal, not a valid observation. This not only protects the leader, but also strengthens the emotional bond of their followers. In psychology, this is called identity fusion. when the leader's figure merges with the group's collective identity. Questioning them feels like a personal attack, and when that happens, reason no longer matters. A second fundamental tactic is the use of informational chaos. Information generates constant crises, endless controversies, and new outrages every week. The goal is to saturate you, fill you with so much noise that you no longer have the energy to analyze anything when everything is urgent. Nothing is important, and in the midst of this emotional bombardment, critical thinking dissolves. There is no room to organize resistance or calm reflection. All that remains is to react and survive. Follow the voice that shouts the loudest. The third tactic is even more dangerous: doublethink, a concept popularized by George Orwell to describe the ability to sustain two contradictory ideas at the same time and act as if both were true. Incompetent leaders master this technique. They change their position without giving explanations. They rewrite their own history, deny what they said yesterday, and their followers, trapped in the emotional meltdown, accept everything without question. In such an environment, the truth becomes a subjective, malleable liquid. Responsibility is diluted, and collective memory decomposes. And this is nothing new. Machiavellianism had already warned us with a brutal phrase: "The vulgar crowd is always carried away by appearances, and the world is almost entirely composed of that crowd." But he didn't say it with contempt. He meant it as a diagnosis. Absolutely everyone is vulnerable to this type of manipulation when we're unaware of how it works. The second practice is to develop real media literacy, to learn to distinguish between information and entertainment, to consciously choose what you consume, from whom you consume it, and why, to question what seems too perfect, too emotional, too viral, to filter more, to react less. Truly successful people say no to almost everything, and that also applies to information. The more noise you eliminate, the more clarity you have. The third practice is to recover the habit of philosophical reflection, to stop, to breathe, to think, to observe the world without the rush that distorts everything. The ancient Stoics did it every day. They asked themselves, "What did I do today? What did I think? What did I learn?" It's a form of power, because when you stop reacting to everything and start choosing, the game changes. You are no longer just a confused spectator. Through the chaos, you become someone who can transform your environment from within. But this isn't just an individual endeavor. We also need to redesign. The systems we inhabit can and should be designed to curb bias, deception, and incompetence. There are three essential pillars here, too. The first is to establish strong accountability mechanisms, institutions that provide honest feedback, even if that makes those in power uncomfortable. The difference between a company with an independent board and one where the board is merely a seal of approval is enormous. The second pillar is to promote cognitive diversity, not just aesthetic or political diversity, true diversity of thought. Teams that think differently make fewer mistakes, detect more risks, and see more angles. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's necessary if we want smarter decisions. The third pillar is transparency. Clear rules that prevent complexity from becoming an excuse to hide the truth. It is not enough to teach technical skills. We must cultivate critical thinking, ethical discernment, the ability to see beyond appearances. Athens founded the Florence Academy and nurtured humanism. Great civilizations not only produce knowledge, they also cultivate wisdom. So now the question is, in your community, what protections exist? Which ones are needed? And what kind of world could we build if we redesigned our institutions and our minds around real competence, humility, and truth? As Machiavelli said, it is not titles that honor men, but men who honor titles. Power does not deserve respect for itself. It deserves it only when it is exercised with dignity. And at the end of this reflection, we return to the man who inspired this entire journey, Nicholas Machiavelli. For centuries, he was misunderstood. Many believed he promoted cruelty, lies, and foul play. But he wasn't defending the dark behaviors he described. He was exposing them. His intention was not to justify the abuse of power, but to show how it really works, so that we could one day do better. Because only by understanding the uncomfortable truth, not the idealized one? Can we aspire to build something different, something more just, wiser, more human? Machiavelli was not a cynic. He was a realist with hope, and that hope lives on today in each of us. Every time we choose to think for ourselves, to question easy narratives, and to opt for depth instead of appearances. So I ask you, have you seen these dynamics in your environment? Have you witnessed how incompetence masquerades as leadership? How truth is sacrificed for spectacle? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you and hear how these ideas resonate with you. If this reflection made you think even a little, consider leaving your like, sharing this video with someone who needs it, and subscribing to the channel because this type of content only grows if you push it forward. And remember to check the links in the description for resources and tools to help you on your path. Until next time, remember, understanding darkness doesn't mean surrendering to it. It means gaining the power to light a light.